Oh, the lawn peoples are here, which means that, so I see if you're going to hear outside.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, well, just keep yourself muted and you can always, of course, put things in the chat. Good morning, y'all. Good morning, everybody who's popping in. Going to wait another minute for everybody to finish coming in. Mm-hmm. Good morning, everyone who just recently logged in. All right, people are jumping on board. Yes, good morning, y'all. I'm going to wait one more minute. And we have some people. Today is apparently career day. And so we have some people that might be coming in late as whatever their career Zoom experience is when it's done. So we got some juniors in here. You guys have junior interviews, mock interviews coming up?
Yeah, I think in January.
January. That will be interesting. You know, I have to say, is as awkward and uncomfortable as this whole kind of online thing is, if you guys learn in some way to get comfortable with it, familiar with it, it will play to your advantage in the long term, because an interview happening over Zoom is very, very likely to happen for a lot of you guys in the future, because you might be hired by somebody who doesn't live in your town. You know, or if it's from a company, you might be interviewing with somebody literally is hundreds of miles away. So try to just, you know, wrap your head around that, as in this is not a fake experience anymore. This is actually a prequel to things that are likely to happen for many people in the future. All right, there's 27 of you guys on board. We'll get started. So today, as promised, we're going to look at what is now commonly known as civil disobedience, which is an essay, but it started out as a speech written by Peter Henry Emerson, and it got a little bit of traction in the 19th century, but it got a lot of traction in the 20th century. And a lot of people look back on it as a sort of a seminal book that made them think about protest and how to effectively protest. But before we do that, I want to ask you guys, and you put it in the chat or you can shout it out. What are laws? I mean, this is a government class, and the whole point of government, the social contract is that we gain a certain safety by living in society. We give up certain rights, or certain selfish rights, but we do that to gain a sense of safety and belonging in civil society. So within that, we write laws. But what are laws really? What's the sort of the meta motive for creating laws? Take a stab at it, guys.
Laws are usually made when people are like, hey, this thing is happening and it's not super cool, and we kind of need rules around this. Could we have some help here?
Okay. So, and Ramora put in there, they're kind of like rules. Yeah. And so what motivates us to write these rules?
If like something happens that affects like the well-being of people, someone, like said in the chat, like to keep people safe and stuff from things that are potentially harmful. Okay.
Laws are rules to try to prevent harmful behaviors.
Basically, for some rules.
The safety of ourselves. Something happens that people don't like, so therefore we make a rule so you can't do that. And the most obvious one, the most common one, is it's the part right out of the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not kill." Although every level of authority has engaged in that, ironically. Rules within a society regulate actions and individuals within the betterment of the whole. Okay, yeah, to the betterment of the whole. So laws come out of what? Our sense of right and wrong. Would that be fair to say? Our sense of right and wrong, and maybe what we consider ethics. So, and the reason I ask you this, and it's interesting to hear you puzzle it out, and adults would do the same thing. Adults would puzzle it out, and yet laws are so common. We live under them, and there's books and books and books of laws, and there's books written about the laws and how to judge the laws, and there's whole libraries filled with this. So laws are part of the water we swim in, and yet what really are laws? And it's interesting how little actually we think about that. It's a really good cop show, and actually in the last season to deal with Americans who don't accept the American laws. Oh, interesting. Okay. I like the name Bosch because you go back to Hieronymus Bosch, and then you get crazy psychedelic art from the 16th century.
Yeah, in the show, there's these Americans who basically don't accept the Constitution and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't accept all laws of government, and they do some pretty radical stuff due to that.
So they're anarchists?
Yes, they're basically anarchists. And
okay.
It's all spurred due to some things, but I don't want to spoil it too much. But it just deals with these people who basically say, I am no part of your government, even though that they basically own land, have phones, all this good stuff. And it's like, you're living in a American world, yet where there's laws, yet you don't accept them, and you're like, everyone should be free from the government and the taxpayers, but yet you are like, everyone should be free, then proceed to put be in the way of other people.
Right. Sounds like they're coming from a place of privilege.
Uh-huh.
So the opposite of laws. What is the opposite of laws? Is it chaos? Okay, that's word catcher puts in there. So, and if you break a law, you've committed a crime. Okay, and crime is generally agreed to be not a good thing. Okay, so I'm going to show you, before we even start reading about what Thoreau wrote, I'm going to show you some quotes about civil disobedience, or on the theme of civil disobedience. Okay, and we're going to read through them, but then I'm going to give you guys some time to think about it, because some of these are pretty spanking radical. And if I can find, oops, 1 second. I thought I had the page up and I didn't. I don't. So I have to, whoop. Okay. Now I can share it with you. So this is, we're going to, I'll read this for you in just a little bit, but I want to do quotes related to civil disobedience. And these come from all different sources and over many different periods of time. Excuse me 1 second. Had to let my dog out of the room. So you can see the first one here is from a Roman poet. So this goes back quite a long ways. He says, "Dare to do things worthy of imprisonment if you mean to be of consequence. Laws control the lesser man. Right conduct controls the greater one." Chinese proverb. "Never do anything against conscience, even if the state demands it," says Albert Einstein. And the word state, what does that mean? Do you guys understand what, when they refer to the state, you know what that means?
It basically means government, right?
Early city states, and now we talk about nation states. We just don't, now we don't use the phrase state with anywhere. Uh-oh, my internet connection is unstable. My computer warns me. So sorry if I glitch a little bit. So state refers to the government of the country or whatever authority you're under the domain of. So never do anything against conscience, even if the state demands it. This is one I like. No radical change on the plane of history is possible without crime. Then when leaders act contrary to conscience, we must act contrary to leaders. And this was said in the 1986 Veterans Fast for Life, when veterans, and veterans being people who have served in the armed forces, went up on the Capitol steps of the United States to protest policy we had at that time in Central America. So that was an active fast on the steps of the Capitol building. It is dangerous to be right in matters on which the established authorities are wrong, says Voltaire. If the machine of government is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. That is out of what we're going to read. That's Thoreau. You are not supposed to be so blind with patriotism you can't face reality. Wrong is wrong, no matter who says it, said Malcolm X. Human history begins with man's act of disobedience, which at the very same time, the beginning of his freedom and the development of his reason. And so, and he is an early father of psychoanalysis, Eric Fromm. Each man must for himself alone decide what is right and what is wrong, which course is patriotic and which isn't. You cannot shirk this and be a man. To decide against your conviction is to be an unqualified and excusable traitor, both to yourself and to your country. Let men label you as they may. If we desire respect for the law, we must first make the law respectable, says Supreme Court Judge Louis Brandeis. Laws are only words written on paper, words that change on society's whim and are interpreted differently daily by politicians, lawyers, judges, and policemen. Anyone who believes that all laws should always be obeyed would have made a fine slave catcher. Anyone who believes that all laws are applied equally despite race, religion, or economic status is a fool, says John Miller. And that was written in 1991, I believe. Disobedience, the rarest and most courageous of the virtues, is seldom distinguished from neglect, the laziest and commonest of vices. George Bernard Shaw. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Martin Luther King. We're actually going to read more from this Letters of Birmingham Jail. It is necessary to distinguish between the virtue and the vice of obedience. Lemuel K. Washburn. As long as the world shall last, there will be wrongs. And if no man objected and no man rebelled, those wrongs would last forever. Clarence Darrow. Ordinarily, a person leaving a courtroom with a conviction behind him would wear a somber face, but I left with a smile. I knew I was a convicted criminal, but I was proud of my crime. Martin Luther King. If you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. And last, white silence equals white consent, BLM. So what I want you guys to do for a bit of time, and I want you to put it in the chat, I want you to read through these again yourself. And I want you to pull out ones that for you are either especially strong or especially shocking, because these are all advocating breaking a law. So I want you to read through this, like I said, and then I want you to put the lines, and you can quote lines, or you can cite whoever wrote it. Ones that seem especially strong or especially shocking. So if you would be willing to do that, please. I'm going to give you like, I don't know, 7 minutes to do that. Okay, which module is it? Okay, so let me back up. Fair question. Let me back up and show you. So up to the modules. Pay attention, y'all. So down, 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 down. And so right here, resistance to civil government. This is your assignment, but that's not going to happen today, probably. So here we are, resistance to civil government, and then there are all of these. So Mm-hmm. So I've heard from some of you, but keep them coming, guys. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do like that Voltaire one. I think that's actually quite a strong one. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. He's okay. He's okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and some of you guys have put in several, which I like a lot. And some of you guys I haven't heard from. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, so I said 7 minutes, and 7 minutes is up. So I'm going to put in a thing for the chat, which is, oh, I just beat you, Ella. Yeah, so you guys picked out a lot of the good ones. There's one that I'm going to show you that I think is, yes. That MLK quote, by the way, was written, the letter from a Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King, of course, was arrested and put in jail. And he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail on a scrap of with a scrap of a pencil on toilet paper, because they wouldn't give him real paper. And he wrote it on toilet paper. And it's a long, it's an essay written on toilet paper. And we will look at it later. It's incredibly articulate, but it puts out, I mean, it breaks it down into laws that are ethical and laws that are unethical. And he really separates the two. So my question here says, are they ethical to obey or ethical to disobey? Of course, it's situational. Depends on the situation and depends on what the law is about. The one that really struck me going here is this part right here. Anyone who believes that all laws should always be obeyed would have made a fine slave catcher. Yeah, that's one where it's like, yep, it was legal, it was the law, and it was about as unethical a thing to do as you could possibly imagine. But many of these in here, did you find, as we were going through, did you find yourself going, wow, like a little bit shocking to see someone say something like that? I mean, they're advocating breaking laws. Did any of you find them to be shocking at all? Admire their bravery, because if you break a law, guess what's going to happen, right? And that is part of the point. So something to wrap your head around. Every major social change that has moved in toward the direction of justice, the arc of justice, as Martin Luther King said, every single one of those changes involves somebody breaking a law. Somebody got arrested, somebody went to jail in defense of a higher ethic that the law was in the way of. So women getting the right to vote, there plenty of women went to jail over that. Civil rights laws, you know, how many people went to jail over that? The people that sat at the lunch counters, the African-American men and women that sat at the lunch counters protesting the fact that it was illegal for them to sit at those lunch counters, they got arrested. They got arrested en masse, right? The whole thing of peaceful protest assumes that you might get arrested and that you are willing to put your body on that line to make a point, right? To make the injustice visible. So all the social progress that we've made and still need to make involve breaking a law, which is not something that you're taught in grade school, right? Pardon me. So I'm going to go through this. We'll get through it by 11 o'clock, probably sooner than that. I'm going to read for you. It's a very redacted version of civil disobedience. It's much longer than what we're going to read here, and it's, you know, it's 1848 language. So if you go at the top of that Canvas page, there's a PDF of it. So if you want to click on that, you can follow along, or you can follow when I screen share. But you should annotate it, which is to say, take notes on what, if the stuff is confusing, and it is dense. It really is dense. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to say, this is what he's talking about. Okay, so follow along, and like I say, annotate it so that you can make sense of it then later on. And Jackson, yes, you are correct about people who got busted for cannabis are still in jail. And there are many states that still do arrest you for that. Not sure if cannabis rises to the level of a civil rights issue. It is a stupid, illegal. Classifying it the way it is stupid, but I'm not quite sure it's a civil rights issue. Okay, so where do I have it? Yep, here we go. That is not it. This is another preview thing, so give me 1 second here. Chase you off my screen. Okay. Stop the share because my computer's being silly. Oh yeah, you're right. Actually, it was, Jackson, you're right. It was racially motivated. In fact, the whole reason it's called marijuana is a Spanish sounding term, which racialized it right from the very beginning. So, On the Duty of Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, original title, Resistance to Civil Government. So, I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. Oh, and by the way, I want to say in here, there will be things probably coming in here that you can feel free to disagree with him. There's parts of this that I also, in large part, do disagree with. So I'm not 100% behind everything Henry David Thoreau says. He slides a little bit into anarchy, which, and I just will say I'm not an anarchist, but I'm gonna clarify what he says to the best degree without my own prejudice coming in and boxing against Henry David Thoreau. So I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe. That government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. Government is at best but an expedient. But most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. What does he mean by expedient? Do you know what that he means by that word? And by the way, I will tell you that as a cheat, if you open the PDF document, down here at the very, very bottom, oops, I have a glossary for you. If it's underlined, that term is defined at the bottom. So expedient, suitable for bringing about a desired result, often without regard to what is fair or right. So when we talked about at the beginning of the semester, why do we even have government? Well, it's to prevent social chaos and to form some kind of social contract. So government is at best but an expedient toward that end, our social contract. But most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. In other words, they fail at being the job that they're there for. The objections which have been brought against a standing army, and they are many and weighty and deserve to prevail, may also be brought against a standing government. The standing army is only an arm of the standing government. The government itself, which is only the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Witness, now this was written, look at the original time that this was given was 1848. When it's published, it's 1849, but it's 1848, and that is exactly the time that the United States is at war with Mexico, a war which we provoked, and we provoked so that we could capture roughly 55% of Mexico. And that 55% of Mexico is now the state of New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and part of Colorado. And we provoked the war. So he obviously is very much against this. Witness the present Mexican war, the work of comparatively a few individuals using the standing government as their tool. He's talking about the president at this point. For in the outset, the people would not have consented to this measure. Governments show thus how successfully men can be imposed upon, even impose on themselves for their own advantage. It is excellent, we must allow. That's sarcasm. Yet this government never of itself furthered any enterprise, but by the alacrity with which it got out of its way. So alacrity meaning, all the way down here, alacrity, a cheerful readiness to do something. So this government never of itself furthered any enterprise, but by the cheerfulness with which it got out of its way. It does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if government had not sometimes got in its way. In other words, the government is not making the United States the great country that it was becoming, unless the government gets out of its way, gets out of our way and lets the American people do those things. And that's what he's saying, said, it does not keep the country free. We keep the country free. It does not settle the West. We settle the West. It does not educate. We educate. Of course, settling the West is another issue because there's people out there that we're moving out of the way. But I'll forgive Thoreau for that. But to speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I asked for not at one no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it. So he's not saying I don't want no government. So he's saying I'm not an anarchist, but I want a better government. And as soon as we can all articulate what it is, what kind of government that would command our respect, then that's a statement, that's a step in the direction towards actually gaining that kind of government. After all, the practical reason why, when the power is once in the hands of the people, a majority are permitted and for a long time continue to rule is not because they are most likely to be the right, nor because this seems fairest to the minority, but because they are physically the strongest. I want to talk about that for just a second. He's talking about the power of the majority. And if you can remember back several weeks to when we looked at Federalist Number 10, written by James Madison, and he was talking about how a Republican form of government with representatives is the most likely to be safe to save minorities from the oppression of a majority. That's kind of what that's what Thoreau's talking about right here. He said, a majority is ruling not because they are most likely to be right, and they're not ruling because what they're doing seems fairest to the minority, but they're ruling because they are physically the strongest. They're the majority. And that is what democracy asks for. Democracy says a majority wins. So what if the majority, it wins, but what if they're unjust? What if they're not fair to the minority? What if they're not right? They still win because they're the strongest. But a government in which the majority rules in all cases cannot be based on justice, even as far as men understand it. Can there not be a government in which the majorities do not virtually decide right and wrong, but conscience decide right or wrong, in which majorities decide only those questions to which the rule of expediency is applicable? So in other words, majorities decide questions as an expedient, not as a right or wrong, but because this is the simplest way to do it. Must the citizens ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? In other words, you might be in the minority. You might be a minority of one, right? Do you give up your conscience just because legislation, laws disagree with you, or you disagree with the laws? Do you resign your conscience to the legislator? You just hand over your judgment to the elected official. Why has every man a conscience then? I think we should be men first and subjects afterwards. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right. In other words, obeying your conscience. Laws never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even well disposed are daily made the agents on injustice. And when he says by means of their respect for it, he means obeying the law. By obeying the law, even well disposed are daily made the agents on injustice. So laws don't make us more just. And when we obey all of them without reflection, sometimes it makes us unjust. A common and natural result of an undue respect for the law is that you may see a file of soldiers, and this is referring now to the Mexican-American War. You may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporals, privates, powder monkeys, and all, marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars, against their will, aye, against their common sense and consciences, what makes it very steep marching indeed, and produces a palpitation of the heart. That's a rapid beat of the heart. They have no doubt that it is a damnable business in which they are concerned. They are all peaceably inclined. In other words, their consciences of all of these people, the colonels, the captains, the corporals, the privates, the powder monkeys, they are all peaceably inclined. And yet they're marching off to war. Now, what are they? Men at all? Or small movable forts and magazines, ammunition magazines, at the service of some unscrupulous or unprincipled man in power? And he's talking specifically about President Polk at that time, right? So a common and natural result of an undue respect for the law. Undue respect for the law. In other words, some of these laws do not demand our respect. But when you do it anyway, you're just like these soldiers. You know what you're doing is wrong. You don't want to be there. You're peaceably inclined, and yet you're going off to war because you're told to. And then that makes you basically, you're just, as he says, a small movable fort instead of a real person. The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army and the militia, jailers, constables, posse comitatus, which is the people that are supporting all the groups, the organization that supports the state. In most cases, there is no free exercise whatever of the judgment or of moral sense, but they put themselves on a level with wood and earth and stones. And wooden men can perhaps be manufactured that will serve the purposes as well. In other words, it's saying, why do we even have a heart? Why do we have a brain? Right? We're just doing things like ants. We're just following orders. So as he says, and maybe wooden men can be created that'll do this job just as well as real people. So such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt. They have the same sort of worth only as horses and dogs. Yet such as these even are commonly esteemed good citizens because they follow the laws. Others, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads, and as rarely make any moral distinctions, they are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. In other words, they're just bureaucrats, and they'll stamp that piece of paper whether it comes from the devil or it comes from God. They're just doing their job. No conscience involved. A very few, as heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers in the great sense, and men, serve the state with their consciences also, and so necessarily resist it for the most part. And they are commonly treated as enemies by it. And that is an important line to understand. So all those people that made quotes, all those lines about if you really want to affect radical change, you have to commit a crime. If you don't resist an unjust law, then you are committing an injustice. But when you do that, you will be seen as an enemy by the state. And so you will get thrown in jail, right? And that is nonviolent resistance recognizes that you're going to be arrested. You will be treated as an enemy, even though you are actually, in a really deep-seated way, you are serving your country at the highest level. But your country won't recognize it for a while. Later on, they'll look back and go, oh yeah, wow, that was really courageous of you. And you did a really great thing for all of us. But at the time, you had the FBI, you had police departments, you had the entire state working to arrest Martin Luther King and bug his phones and go through his letters, his private mail. They were spying on him every chance they had. They saw him as an enemy. And now on January 18th, we will all have a day off from school because of Martin Luther King Day. He who gives himself entirely to his fellow men appears to them useless and selfish. But he who gives himself partially to them is pronounced a benefactor and philanthropist. So each one of these lines carries so much. So if you give yourself totally in service to your fellow men, you won't make a lot of money. You are not going to, until maybe late in your life, you are not going to reach high social standing. You'll be seen by a lot of people as following rainbows and chasing your ideals, even though what you're doing is actually a very high service. But as he says, he who gives himself partially to them, as in, oh, I'm going to give a lot of money to a cause. I'm going to be Bill Gates and set up a foundation, and I'm going to try to do good works through my foundation. Then you're a benefactor and a philanthropist. And then you get lionized, right? And it's not to slam Bill Gates, but the guy has as much money as God. And if he gave himself fully to this effort, these guys, some people have, what's his name for Amazon? He has so much money, so many billions of dollars.
Bezos.
Thank you. Yes, he could eradicate several diseases that have plagued humanity. Like he could eradicate malaria. The money that he has, he could single-handedly change the energy structure of this country and how much we burn in fossil fuels versus how much we burn or how much we use renewables. I mean, they have so much money, right? But they don't give themselves wholly to humanity. They're still making more, but they'll give some to help out in some causes. They get to be the benefactor and the philanthropist. The person who gives himself wholly to other people is generally held up as an idealist and kind of useless and kind of selfish because they just follow their heart, right? So that's an important thing to understand, and there's a lot of truth to that. How does it become a man who behaved toward the American government today? And I would try to keep up in the chat. Yeah, why be the actual savior of humanity when you could just make a brick mansion out of gold bars? Yeah, that's true of that. And he actually, we will get to the point where he touches upon being an actual savior. So how does it become a man to behave toward the American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. And here, heads up for what is so irritating and so pissing Thoreau off. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slaves' government also. And he's already railed against the Mexican-American War. And this government, which recognizes slavery, I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slaves' government also. All men recognize the right of revolution. That is the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or in its inefficiency are great and unendurable. In other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, when a sixth of the population of a nation are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army, a whole country is Mexico, is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army, that's the United States Army, and subject to military law, I think that it is not too soon for an honest man to rebel and revolutionize. What makes this duty more urgent is the fact that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is the invading army. And we did provoke that war. There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery and to the war, who yet in effect do nothing to put an end to them, who, esteeming themselves children of Washington and Franklin, sit down with their hands in their pockets and say they know not what to do and do nothing, who even postpone the question of freedom to the question of free trade, and quietly read the prices current along with the latest advices from Mexico after dinner, and it may be fall asleep over them both. In other words, they postpone the question of freedom and instead let's talk about free trade instead. And quietly read the prices current. So you're looking at the stock market basically, and with the latest advices from Mexico, and then read the news that's coming out of Mexico. How's the war going? But they're doing nothing, and then they just go to sleep. What is the price current of an honest man and a patriot today? They hesitate and they regret, and sometimes they petition, but they do nothing in earnest and with effect. They will wait well disposed for others to remedy the evil, that they may no longer have it to regret. At most, they give up only a cheap vote. I wouldn't say cheap vote, but only vote, and a feeble countenance and Godspeed to the right as it goes by them. There are 999 patrons of virtue to one virtuous man. Does that make sense to you guys? In other words, there's 999 people in the stands clapping the one person who actually is doing something. Actually, they're not clapping. They're probably condemning that person because that person seems like they're breaking the law. Whereas the 999 are on the safe side of the law, which means they're doing nothing. It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty at least to wash his hands of it, and if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support. So what's he saying there, you guys? And I understand this language is a little difficult, but what is he saying there? Any guesses? Any stab at it? You guys need some help? It's an important point to understand.
Some help would be appreciated.
Okay, so it is not a man's duty to devote himself to the eradication of a wrong, even if it's a big wrong. In other words, there are wrongs in every direction. So to pick on any one person, to say Hunter or Tobias or Jackson or Lazarus, it's your job to see that that wrong is righted. That's kind of unfair. It puts too much of a burden on one person. And you may have other concerns to engage you, right? You may be a person who has people dependent on you. You may have to show up for other people, right? Which necessitate, that's where you dedicate your time and your energy. So it's not your job to personally take on the evils of the world and make sure they're righted, okay? But, there's the but. It is your duty, your job, to wash your hands of it. In other words, to clear yourself from engaging in that same wrong. And if you're not going to think about it anymore, at least don't give it your support. Okay, and so, and he explains here now, if I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must see first, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. I must first get off him that he may pursue his contemplations too. In other words, I can't be on somebody else's back. And if I am, I need to get off. That's right. It may not cure that man's situation entirely, but at least I'm not adding my weight to his shoulders. I have heard some of my townsmen say, I should like to have them order me to go out, help out, put down an insurrection of the slaves or to march to Mexico. See if I would go. In other words, these people are saying they wouldn't get me to do that. And yet those very men have each directly by their allegiance and so, meaning also indirectly, at least by their money, furnished a substitute. So they didn't go themselves, but they're paying, say, taxes, which go to the government, which then go to the soldiers and to the army, which is doing this unjust act. As I'll show you later, Thoreau spent a night in jail because the tax collector knocked on his door and said, you know, you're delinquent in taxes a couple of years. And he said, yeah, that's right. And he said, well, you need to pay up. And he said, no, because if I pay taxes, then you're going to use my tax money to do something that I think is highly unjust and I'm not paying. So he went to jail for the night. He's still a little bit privileged because he didn't go to jail for 10 years. He got bailed out by a friend who could afford to pay the bail. So, you know, Thoreau is sitting in a privileged position saying this. But that's what he's saying. By their money, he's furnishing a substitute. So yeah, I may not go, but I'm still participating in the system which is generating the unjust act. The soldier is applauded who refuses to serve in an unjust war by those who do not refuse to sustain the unjust government which makes the war. So a soldier may rebel, and we applaud that soldier, but we still sustain the government, which sustains the unjust war, which means we're still participating in it. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? So, do we obey them? Do we work hard to change them, but obey them until we have changed it? Or do we break the law at once? Men generally under such a government as this think they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. Yeah, you'll get thrown in jail. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? So this is a great question. In other words, why is it, the government, not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? In other words, why doesn't the government set up a situation in which it says to the population, how are we getting this wrong? Where are we promoting injustice and how do we fix it? Help us understand this so we can fix it. He's saying that should be part of the role of government, which is to encourage people to make it better. And in theory, that is what democracy should be about. And that is what legislation should be about. Legislation should be about improving what is wrong and making life better for everyone. And yet, very often it's not the case. And when you visibly demonstrate what is wrong, very often you're arrested and thrown in jail. So why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage its citizens to point out its faults and do better than it would have? Why does it always, come on, highlight here, it's not highlighting. Why does it always crucify Christ and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther and pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? All of these people have been crucified, excommunicated, or pronounced rebels at one time. In other words, these guys all broke the law. And at least in Christian lore, Christ is the most signal character who does that. Christ threatened the power structure. He protested. And because of that, they crucified him, right? And so why is we always, saying we constantly re-crucify these people? Why do we do that? Why don't we see in them that they're wise and actually trying to help? But no, because they threaten the power structure. Thank you, Hunter, for that. If in the chat, Hunter put in a really interesting, did the math, Jeff Bezos could make 11,338 houses made out of gold bricks. That's amazing. Which would, I guess, house 11,338 families, but he could build.
It's amazing, but it's stupid. It's so stupid.
It is. Well, actually, Jeff Bezos has enough money that he could cure homelessness in this country.
Yeah.
Single-handedly, without any act of government. It would take no act of government. He could just pay for it and still be richer than God.
Yeah, there's so much wrong with how much money he has and how so many people are suffering right now. How the suffering is continuing. These people aren't like resourcing the money. They're like, I have this bunch of money. Like there's this one comic of like Jeff when he's in elementary school and he's like, I want to be a dragon when I grow up. And he's like, you can't be a dragon when you grow up, Jeff. And then there's a picture of him in the Amazon like bank vault, and it's just a bunch of gold coins, and he's just huddled on top of
Right.
it.
And then he is a dragon protecting.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So to continue. So why does it always crucify Christ? It being the government, or actually civil society, honestly. If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go, let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. In other words, if the injustice is just part of the mechanism with which government operates, eventually that friction, the injustice, will double back and wear the machine out. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. In other words, something seriously will break, and then maybe worse things will happen. But if it is such a nature that it requires, if it is of such a nature, the injustice is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. And there is in black and white, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see at any rate that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Under a government which imprisons unjustly, the true place for a man, for a just man, is also a prison. And I realize it's almost 11 o'clock, but we're going to finish this. Under a government which imprisons unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. It is there that the fugitive slave and the Mexican prisoner on parole and the Indian come to plead the wrongs of his race should find them. In other words, it's in jail that the fugitive slave, the Mexican prisoner on parole, and the Indian should come to plead their wrongs because the just man is in jail. On that separate but more free and honorable ground where the state places those who are not with her but against her, the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor is in jail. If any think that their influence would be lost there, if any think their influence would be lost in a jail cell, that their voices no longer afflict the ear of the state, that they would not be as an enemy within its walls, they do not know how much truth is stronger than error, how much more eloquently and effectively he can combat injustice who has experienced a little in his own person. In other words, if you've experienced the injustice, you've been thrown in jail, you are that much more eloquent and effective to combat further injustice. So in other words, accept the fact that you're going to be seen as an enemy. It will make you, in his language, it will make you stronger to stand up because you're standing on your conscience. Thus, the state never intentionally confronts a man's sense, intellectual or moral, but only his body, his senses. His man's sense is what he's thinking. It doesn't intentionally confront your intellectual or moral standing. It attacks your body, which is what it throws in jail. It is not armed with superior intelligence or honesty, but with superior physical strength. I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest. If a plant cannot live according to nature, it dies. And so man. So rather than die a slow moral death, stand up and live according to your nature. So this is thick, it's dense, but this is one of the tap roots. It certainly is not the only one, but it is one of the roots of peaceful resistance, which is known as passive resistance, and there's nothing passive about it, actually. But all of the protests that has happened throughout the 20th century has a tip of the cap to Henry David Thoreau and his thesis, because he said it. If a law is unjust, break the law, but then be prepared to suffer the consequences, and that is part of fighting the law. Like I say, you don't have to agree, but there you have it. And it's 11 o'clock, so I have to let you guys go. So next class, I have a debate in paper, an argument that I want you to try to piece your way through, and then there's going to be some questions for you to answer about that. So next class, I have an assignment, and I will give you a good part of that class time to do the assignment, so you don't have to carry it forward into the break, which nobody wants. So thank you for bearing with me, and I'll see you guys next week, next Monday, and have a good and a safe weekend. Okay.
Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you, Patrol.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.